Hi everybody, it's Marc Steiner and welcome to the Marc Steiner Show right here on the Real News Network. Today we have a real pleasure about talking about a man who's written about the 60s from a really interesting perspective. We hear about the 60s because this is 1968, everybody's writing about it, talking about it, analyzing it, tearing it apart, dissecting it, but nobody really has gotten under what these movements were, especially the revolutionary movements, the Leninist movements, what they meant to the movement, how they changed things, and how they altered the way we were. Well, today we're about to talk to Max Elbaum, who's a historian, activist, writer, thinker. His book is called Revolution in the Air. 60s radicals turned to Lenin, Mao, and Che. This is his book, and this is Max. Max, welcome. Good to have you with us.
Thanks. Pleasure to be here, Mark.
He's also a world-class marathoner, we were discovering, and that's interesting. We're not going to run today, though.
No, not today.
Well, welcome. Good to have you here on the Marc Steiner Show at the Real News. So let's just begin. This book is in its third edition.
Right.
So let's take us back to the beginning before we talk about this edition and why you wrote it. I mean, what motivated you? I mean, obviously, you were in the movement. You were part of the left. You were part of the communist movements back in the 60s. But what drove you to write the book in the way you did?
It's the mid-90s, a period of reevaluation among radicals after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Tiananmen Square massacre in China, defeat of the Sandinistas in Nicaragua. I'm working on a magazine called Crossroads, which is a lot of dialogue among people who came out of different parts of the left.
I remember that magazine.
And made a lot of contact with a new generation of radicals who were radicalized a lot in the first Gulf War, moved into anti-war, anti-imperialist politics. They knew about the history, some of the Communist Party, they knew the history of SNCC, they knew a little bit about the history of the Panther Party, but they didn't have any information about the new communist movements, the new revolutionary movements that grew up starting mainly in 1968 and that continued and were a very important force on the left from the 60s through the late 80s. I looked around, tried to find some friends who were in the academic world to see if anyone was going to write a history of this particular part of the left. Couldn't find anybody interested in doing it. I had been a pack rat, I'd been involved in this. I had been the liaison from the group that I was in to a lot of the other communist and socialist groups, so I knew people in all the different parts of the left. So I decided to stop editing that magazine, turn the job over to a younger person, and start working on this book. Some of the younger people I'd been in touch with helped me, read drafts, made critiques, as well as some of the people that I had been in the movement with, and got published in 2002.
And so here you are.
And here I am.
Third printing.
Third edition, yes.
Third edition, right.
It came out in hardcover. It came out the second edition in paperback in 2006, just before the massive immigrant rights demonstrations all over the country. I wrote a second preface to that, sort of with reflections based on the feedback that the book had received from 2002 through 2006. Last summer, Verso, the publisher, called me up and said they wanted to issue a new edition because they thought in the wake of Trump's election, the Bernie Sanders campaign, Black Lives Matter, Occupy, there was a new audience that would be interested in this history. They didn't want me to write anything else for the book, but they wanted me to find a younger activist who was interested in history to write a new forward. I had known Alicia Garza.
Yeah, I was about to ask, how did you get Alicia Garza, who helped found the Black Lives Matter movement in this country with two other women, to write the forward to this? How'd that happen?
Well, Alicia was part of the crowd of younger activists that I had connected with in the mid-90s. And we had worked together on a number of projects. She had obviously a very skilled, extremely talented activist and moved into more in the leadership and some base building community organizing work among low-income communities, communities of color in the Bay Area. So Alicia and I knew each other, and I knew she had looked at, she writes something interesting in the foreword about how she approached the first edition and rereading it now. But we knew each other, and I asked her to write the foreword, and she agreed, and then she worked with the Verso people and put together the foreword to the book.
Before we get into the heart of this question of what the Leninist groups did in the late 60s and 70s into the 80s, and why that exploded and why there was such the diverse number of groups and divisive, I would say, as well as you talk about. Talk a bit about Alicia's take on this and what she said about the movements, why she felt it was so important for her generation to understand what happened then with these groups.
Alicia said in the book launch in the Bay Area, she and I were the program, and she said something very interesting. She said, the good thing about reading this history is you don't have to make the same mistakes that the people did before. You can make new mistakes.
We're always going to make mistakes.
You're always going to make mistakes, and we're going to make new mistakes.
Right.
It certainly would have been nice if I had had that attitude when I was that age in the late 1960s.
A little ahead of us, maybe, which is good.
But which shows that there is progress from one generation to the next. So I think that's the spirit that that I wrote the book and approached the book. This book is not okay. Here's what we did. Here's what you should do. That's not appropriate. Plus, I have
anyway.
I have my opinions, but it's not like I have some prescription. What you want to do when you're writing about left experience, radical politics, you share the experience, you put it out there, and then people have access to it, and they'll make of it different things. Different people will make of it different things. I think there are some patterns in left history, in U.S. history, in the global revolutionary movements, that it's useful for people to have a long-term historical perspective. Every generation of the left has thought this is the final conflict, and so far it hasn't worked out that way. So some understanding of history is a good idea, but it's really up to each generation to reinvent the left based on their experience.
I don't want to digress into this, but you said made me think the reality that if you really study dialectics, whether you like Marx or Buddha or both or not, or whoever you like, that dialectics itself, the nature of it, tells us there can be no end. What causes the explosion of Leninist groups in this country in the late 60s and early 70s that has such a visible effect on the movement?
Well, especially the pivotal year, 1968, the whole, what we then called the Third World, now it's usually termed the Global South, Asia, Africa, Latin America, the Middle East, was exploding with anti-imperialist movements, movements against Western domination, movements against colonialism, movements against white supremacy. This is connected to the Black freedom movement in the United States, which was the anchor of the 1960s movements. So it was the rising of the peoples of the world, what Frantz Fanon called the wretched of the earth. And there was a sense between that and the events in France in 1968 that even with all the horrors of that time, the tremendous sense that we were part of a human surge and we were going to create a new world. And
fair to say, we actually thought at that moment that a revolution was going to happen and capitalism would be overthrown.
Capitalism would be, 1/3 of the people in the world had already broken with capitalism. The national liberation movements were rising. There was almost a revolution in the heart of industrialized Western Europe. You had the Black freedom movement and all the new movements of the 1960s here coming out of that. So we weren't so naive as to think it would be a straight line. We did think that after a brief lull, there would be a new upsurge. There would be a new radicalization that would even be greater than that in 1968. And the mindset of a lot of us who came in that time was then, well, what happened in the 60s was there was this huge uprising of peoples. But in the United States, there wasn't a political leadership that could capture that energy and move forward the way that, at the time, we interpreted the Vietnamese, the Cubans, the Chinese had made their revolutions. So the thinking was we needed to prepare a vanguard-type group in order to be ready for the next upsurge and move it another step forward closer to revolution. Of course, when you think you're on the verge of revolution, certain kinds of differences of opinion loom very large. When in a period that would be more a defensive period or a different kind of period, those differences don't matter so much in terms of building a broad coalition to defend what gains you may have made and prevent a right-wing backlash. And we were off base in terms of thinking. We underestimated the resilience of U.S. capitalism and the ability of the ruling class to retrench, use racism, xenophobia, anti-feminism, homophobia to do a backlash against the 1960s movements. So in 1980, instead of a new upsurge to the left, we got Ronald Reagan. And we had spent too much time in the 70s anticipating a very different future. Took us a long time to readjust.
So I'm curious how you analyze and think that these movements, and you talk about all of them, the October League, the Revolutionary Union, Communist Labor Party, all the various Leninist groups that took place. They were very active, some in factories, some in communities. I mean, they were actually organizing and doing work, but they were also very split. So what effect do you think they actually had on the movement itself, on the left, on progressive change? How did it affect political life?
Well, the groups had much less effect on American politics because we were divided than we would have had if we had been united. So I think that's one part.
You make that
of it.
point a lot in this book,
that some of the ideological issues and some of even just the turf battles and sectarianism between different groups inhibited us. On the other hand, those kinds of groups unleashed a tremendous amount of energy, like you just mentioned, Mark. I mean, we're talking about several thousands of people going into the working class communities. If they weren't originally from those communities, many were. This was the generation where the first large numbers of working class kids of all backgrounds went to college. A lot of them were into giving back to the community, which in the late 60s and 70s meant becoming a revolutionary. So there were organizers in all kinds of factories, hospitals, offices, communities, leading struggles around anti-racism, struggles for unionization, struggles to democratize unions.
And among the steel workers and among auto workers and miners, there were these revolutionary movements as well inside those unions.
Absolutely.
All that was taking place.
Absolutely. And those groups did provide support, training, propaganda, coordination. I mean, the positive side of those kinds of groups was if you were in a group I was organizing before I became a full-time editor of the group I was in, this newspaper. I was a hospital worker and organizing in the hospital. So I was organizing in the hospital, but you had connections with people who were organizing in the community, with people who were doing international solidarity. You got a report of someone who may have gone to Chile or Vietnam or Palestine. And so you were part of an organization that gave you didn't have to find out everything on your own. There were people you trusted who were involved in other movements. Now, the negative side of those kinds of organizations, they proved too top-down and too undemocratic. That model might have been appropriate for a military situation, but not so much for the nature of politics in the United States in the 70s and 80s.
That could be one of the reasons why those movements were so antithetical to many people involved in the movement, because of that militaristic approach and militaristic organization didn't fit with the innate participatory democratic feeling that most people had about the movement.
That's right. The 60s, one of the ironies of this movement is that a lot of the leaderships and I mean, of course, younger people came into the movement. The movement recruited people in the 70s and 80s, but a lot of the people who had come through the 60s were independent-minded, dissidents. No one was just taking orders from anybody else. But
sex, drugs, and rock and roll.
Sex, drugs, and rock and roll. But people were really committed to revolutionary politics and making that the center of gravity of their life. And were willing to adjust and transform themselves in ways that at the time we thought were necessary in order to do that. You know, Bertolt Brecht has one of his poems about we were hard, we were unforgiving. You have to forgive us because we were at that kind of a time. If you're in that kind of a time, that kind of thing is the way you survive and you defeat the enemy. But we were not in that kind of a time. And we were not in a moment where everything was coming down to military struggle and so on.
But it was hard at that moment. I think it's really important to say here before I get into the nitty-gritty of the stuff you were talking about and how you parse these things out. It was hard for people at that time because you were seeing the massive repression in the black community and communities of color all throughout this country who tried to start movements for change. You saw the FBI and the federal government coming in and putting people in jail, literally killing people across the movement. You had the insurgencies going all through Mozambique and Angola and Guinea-Bissau and all throughout Africa. There was Cuba and Vietnam. Things were going on in Asia. There was the debate between China and Russia. All that was going on. In Western Europe, the ferment was exploding in Italy and France, especially in places like that. So people actually had the feeling that something dramatic was about to change. And that the only way to do it was to be a vanguard and be in the front of it and pull the world along with you for this revolution that was supposed to take place. I mean, that was a real feeling among a lot of people.
Absolutely. And the new communist movement, this section of the left that I was writing about, a lot of the leadership were former members of the Panther Party, were people who came out of the Young Lords organization, were people who had experienced that kind of repression. My book goes through in those groups, 7 new communist movements were assassinated. 7 people were assassinated in the course of that movement. So that was a real thing. The complication is that the predominant form of struggle in the United States was nonviolent mass action, including but not limited to electoral politics, but demonstrations, sit-ins, strikes, and so on. It was not moving to a period where armed struggle or that semi-militant military thing was happening. You're exactly right. There were reasons in our experience. It wasn't just, we read a book somewhere and decided to, do that kind of organization. But we were one-sided in seeing only that side and not recognizing that, the system was capable of offering enough to enough people to the movement went into an ebb. And then you have to readjust. One of the key things of all political left-wing things is how do you move flexibly from one kind of period to another? And we did catch up. And a lot of the people who were in this movement played important roles in the movements of the 80s, Central America Solidarity, the Rainbow Coalition, the anti-apartheid movement, those kinds of movements. So we did readjust. But by the time we readjusted, we had suffered some losses.
So I'm curious, really to explore what the positive and negative aspects of this for you. I mean, you write that things stalled, you thought, that kind of this innovative world that was going on with the revolutionaries in America in the late 60s and 70s, you said, became mired in dogmatist orthodoxy and moralistic intolerance, reproducing the worst traits of their predecessors instead of their strengths. They ended up making party building a fetish and construction only sex. That's pretty damning of groups, whatever these groups were. So what does that mean? Why did that happen, and what does that mean? I mean, what was the result of that?
Well, the result of that was the tremendous potential this movement displayed at its early period wasn't realized. This movement attracted the plurality of people who became revolutionaries in the late 60s, and especially the plurality of people coming out of the freedom movements and communities of color. And it was very dynamic in its early years, and it made important contributions to the anti-racist struggle, to the labor struggles that you mentioned, those caucuses in the unions, and played some important roles, especially in the 1980s when we were a little more experienced than we were in 1971. We were more experienced in 1981, 82. People played key roles in Harold Washington's campaign in Chicago, in the anti-apartheid movement, solidarity with the Nicaraguans in El Salvador. However, by this time, we had adopted a model that was not durable for politics in the United States.
The model, which
the
model?
model which we had imported a certain, what I called in my book, miniaturized Leninism. We didn't take the broad and expansive notions of Lenin. For example, I make a point of one of his writings saying politics begins not where there are thousands of people, but where there are millions of people. That's where politics start. The irony is that's what we thought in the 1960s, but we didn't realize politics, the millions of people were engaging in politics in the 70s and 80s in a very different way than they did in the 1960s. And it's a problem for today too. Millions of people are involved now in the resistance to Trumpism, to white nationalism, and it's not looking the way it did in the 80s or the way it did in the 60s. Reality is always a little more complicated.
So let's take two pieces I was thinking about coming out of this book. One is if you look back at history, whether you're looking at the 1840s when Marx and Bakunin, the anarchist thinker, and Marx and all the other radical thinkers and revolutionary thinkers in Europe at that time, were very split about what they believed. And the Revolution of 1848 happened, it was suppressed and killed. And I'm a little obsessed with that now because I've watched the young Karl Marx and started reading some of these old philosophers again to kind of figure what that was about. You saw the 1930s, the same thing happened in many ways in this country and around Europe. The Spanish Civil War happened when groups on the left began fighting each other and the fascists in Spain took over. And you see this dynamic now that you're writing about that happened in the 1960s and early 70s, late 60s, early 70s, when these Leninist movements kind of took hold of a lot of people's minds and hearts. So what are you saying in this book to people now in this century about what that period says to us? Does it say anything different to us now than what those periods before us said to us in the 60s? I mean, what are we learning from this?
Well, we're learning a couple things, hopefully, so that there'll be new mistakes in the future.
There will always be mistakes, there'll always be successes, yeah. But what do you think it's saying to us?
Well, I think one thing it's saying is we have much to learn from revolutionary movements all over the world, but we have to make change and revolution in the United States, and we have to look at the patterns of U.S. history. And one of the strengths of this movement was in focusing on the role of the African American liberation movement and the role of black labor in building the United States. It looked back to Reconstruction, to Second Reconstruction, and the notion that you had to try to build, the African American movement has not only been the springboard for advancing the interests of African Americans, but the driving force for opening up space for all the different
throughout
social
American
movements,
history.
Throughout American history. So that's one aspect of things it's teaching. On the point you raise about differences on the left, it's a struggle for a sense of proportion. Differences mean different things at different times. Not every difference of opinion is worth splitting and going to battle within the left about. And this is where politics becomes an art and not a formula. Which differences are important at which time is a judgment call, but people need to stop and think before they argue forever and attack each other on the left. You need a sense of proportion where you try to look at politics not just as the left sees it, but as the communities see it, as the millions of people see it. And that gives you some kind of grounding, some kind of reference point to judge whether your differences of opinion about some historical issue or some theoretical matter is relevant to the urgent struggles of today or not.
So, pardon me, one of the things that you write about, and I think those of us of a certain age experienced living through that time and these movements, was a lot of these Marxist-Leninist movements that took place in the late 60s and early 70s, despite some of the good work that was done and the commitment of the people inside them, for whatever reason, became almost inherently, as you write about, homophobic, sexist in many ways, and in some of the organizations not understanding the power and reason for the struggles around race in America and what they meant. And why do you think that happened, given that people actually came out of movements? This is where the women's movement was created out of SNCC, how the women came out of there, and out of the women's movement that exploded onto America. The riots that took place that founded the gay rights movement in America. They started holding a different sensibility and changing our social and political awareness of who we were. What was wrong, what happened inside these movements that they couldn't accept that, and that in part was part of their downfall?
Yes. I think that's a complicated question, and I think there's a number of factors. Two that I would pick out is, one, we all grew up in the same country. It's a sexist, class-divided, racist, and homophobic society, much more so in attitudinal sense in the late 60s and 70s than it is now. How much has changed in the material sense is another question. And the movement had the attitudes that people brought into it. So there was some element of homophobia that people who grew up before Stonewall in that period, even people on the left, carried that baggage with us. And that's something we needed to be more sensitive to, especially around gender and sexuality issues. Another factor is this particular movement, we fell into, because we had that view of Leninism as the magic bullet that was going to solve all our problems, we needed to square everything with the tradition of the high priesthood of that. And especially the gender and sexuality issues.
It became like fundamentalist religion.
It became like fundamentalists. And I will say that most of the people who were actually the organizers in this movement never fully accepted some of the more backward stuff, but went along with it because that's what they thought was their revolutionary duty. And then the way these groups collapsed was mostly rebellions by the members. It didn't collapse because of financial scandals or something. They collapsed because the members said, look, we're revolutionaries and this is not a revolutionary path.
Exactly.
And most of the organizers from that movement, of course, many people had made great sacrifices. They had to put their lives back together, deal with their families and so on, who are still active today and became some of the most creative and influential people in the labor movement, in communities of color, in the women's movement. A woman who was the head, one of the leadership of the organizations I was in, became the national executive director of the National Gay and Lesbian Task Force. You know, so it was complicated. And people learned a lot of skills in those organizations. The model we had was wrong. And
you think it was totally wrong?
Not totally wrong, but it was inappropriate for the times and contained some flaws that in the conditions of American
partially people
politics.
wanted some structure, and it gave people structure as well.
Structure.
But let's close with this. You write in here about how many people on the hard left, the Leninist left, and were deeply influential and did not support George McGovern in 1972. Not that that's what completely led to his defeat, but people decided from 68 to 72, even in 68 before this happened, people organized, and I was part of that, the vote with your feet, and we got Richard Nixon. And then 72 happened, and people withdrew from McGovern. And that was when a lot of people on the left started entering the Democratic Party. So what do those lessons tell us about now, and Trump, and where we are, for you?
I think that the road to revolutionary change lies through making a difference in people's lives day to day today, as well as linking that to a long-term vision. People will use the means to fight for change that are available before they will turn to harder and riskier roads. And whether the revolutionaries like it or not, in American politics, elections are legitimized for the masses of people. They're the way most people engage in politics. Obviously, there are many people who are disaffected, but most people who engage in politics engage in elections. The left cannot cede that territory to the right wing. The struggle for voting rights was a huge influence on our generation. 1964, Freedom Summer, Goodman, Schwerner, and Cheney. I mean, the three civil rights workers killed in Freedom Summer, the Voting Rights Act. So we have to engage electoral politics. There's obviously differences of opinion on the left on this. My own opinion is the main obstacle to any kind of progress today is the Republican Party that's been captured by white nationalism led by Donald Trump. And until we break the grip of that group of people on all three branches of the federal government and the 25 states, we're not going to get anywhere. So that's a necessary stage of a long-range struggle. We have to build our own independent organizations so that when we do defeat the right, we will not be marginalized again by the corporate Democrats and so on. But if we can't break the Republican grip on power in 2018 and 2020, I think things are going to get a lot worse than even they are today.
Max Elbaum has been our guest here on the Marc Steiner Show on the Real News Network today. He joined us here in Baltimore on his tour around the country for his book, In the Air, 60s Radicals Turn to Lenin, Mao, and Che. Revolution in the Air, excuse me. 60s Radicals Turn to Lenin, Mao, and Che. It's really a great read. You'll learn a lot from this book. It's good to wrestle with, or else Alicia Garza would not have written the foreword to start with. And Max, thank you so much for joining us. Good to have you here on the Marc Steiner Show on the Real News Network. And we'll see you all next week.